The sun hung low over Central Park that afternoon, its warm light filtering through the branches of the towering trees and scattering patterns on the winding paths below. The park was quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity replaced by a serene stillness. Only the occasional chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves broke the silence. Near a weathered fountain, a man sat slouched on an old blue bench, his hood pulled low to obscure his face. His coat, frayed and patched at the edges, looked as though it hadn't seen the inside of a washing machine in years. Beside him rested a brown paper bag, crumpled and stained, while his mismatched sneakers, worn thin, peeked out beneath the ragged hems of his jeans. The man, though outwardly appearing to be just another anonymous figure, was anything but ordinary. Known to the world as Snoop Dogg, he was entirely unrecognizable in this state, his celebrity identity expertly hidden beneath layers of disheveled clothing and a carefully cultivated demeanor. At the park's edge, a police cruiser slowly rolled into the parking lot, its engine humming softly before coming to a stop. Two officers exited the vehicle, their boots crunching against the gravel as their eyes scanned the tranquil scene before them. The younger of the two, Officer Martinez, stood tall and lean, his buzz-cut hair giving him a sharp, military-like appearance. His polished badge gleamed in the sunlight as he adjusted his utility belt, glancing toward his partner. Officer Higgins, in stark contrast, was stockier and carried an air of weariness. His coffee-stained uniform and tired expression suggested years of dealing with the city's daily grind. Martinez nudged his partner and gestured toward the figure on the bench. "Another vagrant," he muttered, the disdain clear in his tone. "This park's starting to look like a homeless shelter." Higgins sighed heavily, his brows furrowing. He wasn't particularly eager to engage, but knew his duty left little choice. "Let's just check it out," he said gruffly. "Could be harmless." The two officers approached the bench with measured steps, their presence heavy and deliberate. Snoop, still sitting quietly, showed no reaction. His gaze remained fixed on the ground, his posture relaxed yet somehow defiant. It was as if he was intentionally daring them to make the first move. "You can't just sit here all day," Martinez barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "This is a public park, not your living room." Snoop's head tilted slightly, his face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. He said nothing, his silence hanging in the air. Slowly, he reached into the crumpled paper bag at his side. Martinez's body tensed immediately, his hand instinctively moving to the baton on his hip. "Careful," Higgins muttered, his voice low but unconvincing. Snoop's movements were deliberate but unthreatening. From the bag he pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Without a word, he began unwrapping it slowly, his focus on the task as if the officers weren't even there. He took a bite, chewing methodically. "Hey, did you hear me?" Martinez snapped, his irritation bubbling to the surface. He took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "I said, you can't just sit here all day. Don't you have somewhere to be?" Snoop paused, his gaze lifting briefly to meet Martinez's. His expression was calm, unreadable. "I'm not bothering anyone," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I'm just eating my lunch." "That's not the point," Martinez retorted, his tone growing more agitated. "People like you make this place look bad. You scare off families, tourists. This isn't your personal hangout." Higgins, standing slightly behind his partner, shifted uncomfortably. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes flicking between Snoop and Martinez. "What's your name?" Higgins asked, his voice less harsh but still authoritative. For a moment, Snoop didn't answer, his fingers tightening slightly around the sandwich. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, Calvin Broadus." Martinez let out a short, derisive laugh. "Calvin Broadus, huh? What, are you a rapper in your spare time?" Snoop didn't rise to the bait. He stayed silent, his face impassive as he took another bite of his sandwich. His lack of reaction only seemed to irritate Martinez further. The younger officer stepped even closer, towering over Snoop as he loomed over the bench. "Let me see some ID," he demanded. Snoop placed his sandwich down carefully on the bench, brushing a few stray crumbs from his lap. From the pocket of his tattered coat, he pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to Martinez. The officer flipped it open, his practiced eyes scanning the ID. The card looked legitimate, though it didn't seem to match the disheveled man sitting before him. With a frown, Martinez handed the wallet back. "What are you doing here, Broadus?" Martinez asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Why aren't you at a shelter or something?" Snoop's gaze flicked up briefly before returning to the ground. "I like the fresh air," he said simply. "Is that a crime?" Higgins cleared his throat, clearly sensing the rising tension between the two. "He's not doing anything illegal," he said quietly to his partner. "We can't just kick him out." Martinez didn't seem to care. "Maybe not," he muttered, narrowing his eyes at Snoop. "But we can make him uncomfortable enough to leave." For the first time, a hint of tension crept into Snoop's otherwise calm demeanor. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his sandwich again, taking another slow bite. The deliberate pace of his actions only seemed to fuel Martinez's frustration. Nearby, a woman walking her dog slowed her pace, her curiosity drawn to the unfolding scene. She hesitated, watching the officers interact with the man on the bench before finally speaking up. "He's not hurting anyone," she called out, her tone firm but cautious. "Why are you bothering him?" Martinez turned sharply toward her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he said, his voice clipped. "We're doing our job." The woman didn't back down. "It's a public park," she said pointedly. "He has as much right to be here as anyone else." Higgins raised a hand, trying to de-escalate. "Ma'am, please," he said, his tone softer. "We're just trying to handle this situation. Move along." The woman hesitated for a moment longer before shaking her head in disbelief. Muttering under her breath, she tugged on her dog's leash and walked away. Snoop watched her leave, a flicker of amusement, or perhaps annoyance, passing across his face. He dusted the crumbs from his lap and set the sandwich down once again. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with a subtle edge of defiance. "You're not under arrest," Higgins replied, though Martinez's jaw clenched visibly. "But you might want to find somewhere else to sit." Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Martinez just a little longer than necessary. Then he rose to his feet, the paper bag tucked under one arm. His movements were deliberate, measured, and as he adjusted the hood of his coat, a stray lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. "Have a nice day," Snoop said, his voice calm but pointed, the hint of a challenge beneath his polite words. Martinez watched him walk away, his eyes narrowing. "Did you see that?" he muttered to Higgins. "The way he looked at me? Guy thinks he's better than us." "Let it go," Higgins replied with a weary sigh. "He's not worth the trouble." As Snoop's figure disappeared down the winding path, the tension in the air began to lift. Yet something lingered, a quiet, unspoken defiance, like a spark waiting to catch fire. Snoop strolled away from the bench, his paper bag tucked neatly under his arm, moving further into the park. His steps were slow, purposeful, yet there was an air of calm defiance in the way he carried himself. He had been through interactions like this before, and they never failed to highlight just how quickly assumptions could dictate behavior. The path ahead curved slightly, leading to a quieter section of the park. Old oak trees clustered in this area, their towering branches offering shade and an almost serene sense of isolation. Snoop found another bench nestled beneath the largest of the trees. This one was a bit more hidden from view, and he lowered himself onto it with the same unhurried demeanor, placing the paper bag beside him. As he leaned back and let his eyes wander up to the canopy above, his calm posture masked a sharp awareness of his surroundings. He wasn't here by coincidence. Everything about this day, this disguise, had been planned with precision. Snoop was conducting his own kind of experiment, one meant to test how people in positions of authority treated those they deemed less fortunate. It wasn't long before his solitude was interrupted. Two joggers came down the path, their sneakers crunching against the gravel. One of them, a middle-aged man wearing a sleek fitness tracker and an expression of mild disdain, slowed his pace when his eyes landed on Snoop. He nudged his companion, a woman in her 30s, and muttered something under his breath. The woman glanced at Snoop briefly, her expression tightening into one of discomfort. "Should we call someone?" the man whispered, his voice carrying just enough for Snoop to hear. "He looks sketchy." Snoop's eyes opened slightly, flicking toward the joggers. His expression remained neutral, his calm gaze following them as they quickened their pace and moved along the path. He said nothing, but the tension in the air was palpable, hanging like a weight between them. Moments later, a group of teenagers on bikes came barreling through the same path. Their laughter was loud and carefree as they weaved between the trees, clearly enjoying the freedom of their ride. One of the boys spotted Snoop sitting on the bench and slowed to a stop, signaling for his friends to follow suit. "Yo, check this out," the boy said, grinning as he pointed at Snoop. "You homeless or something?" Snoop turned his gaze to the boy, his face calm but curious. He didn't respond, letting the boy's question hang unanswered. The teenager, emboldened by Snoop's lack of reaction, leaned closer. "What's the deal, man? You lose your house playing Fortnite or what?" The comment elicited a round of laughter from his friends, their voices a cacophony of jeers and taunts. One of them pulled out a smartphone, holding it up as if to record the encounter. "Say something for the camera, man," he said mockingly. "Tell us your life story." Snoop finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You should get going," he said, his gaze steady. "This isn't a place for games." The teenagers hesitated, their laughter faltering. There was something about his tone, quiet yet commanding, that gave them pause. They exchanged uncertain glances, but before they could decide whether to leave or press further, the distant sound of a police cruiser's engine reached their ears. The boys scattered like leaves in the wind, their bikes kicking up dust as they pedaled away. The cruiser pulled up to the same path, its tires crunching against the gravel. Officer Martinez stepped out first, his sharp eyes immediately locking onto Snoop. His partner, Officer Higgins, followed more slowly, his expression one of mild exasperation. "You again," Martinez said, his tone sharp as he strode toward the bench. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" Snoop didn't move. His posture remained relaxed as he regarded the officer with calm eyes. "Is sitting on a bench against the law now?" he asked evenly. Martinez's jaw tightened, frustration flickering in his expression. "You've got a smart mouth," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I don't like smart mouths." "Good thing I'm not here to make friends," Snoop replied, his voice steady but unbothered. Higgins stepped in, his tone measured as he tried to diffuse the tension. "What's going on here?" he asked, glancing between his partner and Snoop. "Why are we back?" Martinez's eyes narrowed, his gaze never leaving Snoop. "I don't trust him," he said curtly. "He's up to something." Higgins sighed heavily. "He's sitting on a bench," he said, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Let it go." But Martinez wasn't ready to back down. He took another step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Lunch," he said simply. "Prove it," Martinez snapped. Raising an eyebrow, Snoop reached for the bag. He moved slowly, his actions deliberate, as if to ensure there was no misunderstanding. He opened the bag and held it out, letting Martinez peer inside. The officer frowned, his suspicion deepening when he saw nothing but an apple, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. "You got anything else on you?" Martinez pressed. "Something you don't want us to find?" Snoop set the bag down, his movements calm and precise. "I've got nothing to hide," he said evenly. "But if you're looking for trouble, I'm not the one you'll find it with." Higgins shook his head, his patience wearing thin. "Let him go," he said to his partner. "We've got better things to do." But Martinez hesitated, his instinct screaming that there was more to this man than met the eye. He didn't know what it was yet, but he was determined to find out. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," Martinez said, his voice low and sharp. "Most people in your situation would be a little more nervous." Snoop's expression didn't change. "Most people aren't breaking any laws," he replied simply. "Are you saying I should be nervous?" The officer stepped even closer, the tension between them thick. "I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose," Martinez said, his hand still resting on his baton. "That makes me wonder what you're hiding." "I've got nothing to hide," Snoop replied. "You've searched me. You've searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you." Higgins sighed again, his tone firm as he addressed his partner. "Enough," he said. "We're not turning this into something it's not. Let's move on." For a moment, it looked like Martinez might argue. His face was flushed with anger and frustration, his jaw tight as he stared down at Snoop. But then, reluctantly, he took a step back, letting his hand fall from his baton. "Fine," he muttered through gritted teeth. "We'll go." Snoop watched silently as the officers turned and began walking back toward their cruiser. As Martinez reached the car, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes met Snoop's for a brief moment, and in that instant, an unspoken challenge passed between them. In the cruiser, Higgins shook his head as he climbed into the driver's seat. "You've got to let this stuff go," he said, his voice weary. "It's not worth the trouble." "It's not about trouble," Martinez muttered, staring out the window. "It's about respect. That guy thinks he's untouchable." "He's not," Higgins replied, starting the engine. "Just let it go. We've got better things to do." But Martinez couldn't let it go. His mind raced, piecing together every small detail that had seemed off. The calmness in Snoop's voice, the confidence in the way he carried himself, the unflinching way he had handled every interaction. It didn't add up. Martinez's frustration simmered as he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts consumed by the man on the bench. Back in the park, Snoop remained seated, his calm demeanor unshaken. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, turning it over in his hand. A faint smile played on his lips as he leaned back against the bench, the game unfolding exactly as he had planned. The late afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the park as Snoop remained on the bench, his posture relaxed, but his mind sharp. He was in no rush to leave. He knew patience was part of the game. Every detail, every interaction, every glance was being recorded, a part of the larger experiment that he'd planned meticulously. It didn't take long for the familiar hum of the police cruiser to break the park's serenity once more. The sound grew louder as the car circled back, its tires crunching against the gravel. Snoop didn't move, keeping his gaze fixed on the horizon. The calm air around him seemed to contrast sharply with the growing tension emanating from the approaching officers. This time, Officer Martinez exited the car with more urgency, his steps brisk and purposeful. His partner, Higgins, followed behind, his face a mask of quiet frustration. It was clear that the older officer had grown weary of his partner's obsessive focus on the man in the hooded coat. Martinez stopped a few feet from the bench, his eyes narrowing. "We're not done with you yet," he said, his tone sharp. Snoop finally looked up, his expression neutral but his eyes gleaming with a quiet defiance. "Didn't realize sitting on a bench was a crime," he said evenly. Martinez ignored the comment, gesturing toward the bag by Snoop's side. That ID you gave us? It doesn't exist, he said. Care to explain? Agent Tracy. Snoop raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. Maybe your system's broken, he replied. Or maybe you're looking for something that isn't there. Don't get smart with me, Martinez snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I know a fake when I see one. Higgins stepped in, his tone more measured. Look, he said, addressing Snoop directly. If you've got a reason for being here, just tell us. Otherwise, you're making this harder on yourself. Snoop leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. What exactly do you think I'm hiding? He asked, his voice curious rather than defensive. Martinez took another step closer, his hand resting on his baton. I don't know yet, he said. But you're too calm, too confident. People don't act like that unless they've got something to hide. Higgins sighed heavily, his patience wearing thin. Enough, he said firmly, turning to his partner. You've got nothing on him. Let it go. But Martinez refused to back down. His mind raced, his instincts screaming that there was more to this man than met the eye. He grabbed his radio, pressing the button as he spoke. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a deeper record check on an individual named Calvin Broadus. ID provided earlier. The radio crackled with a faint response. Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by. Snoop didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering as he watched the younger officer. His calmness only seemed to agitate Martinez further, who paced slightly, his hand still on his baton. You're very determined, Snoop said after a long pause, his voice calm but pointed. Almost flattering. The comment only fueled Martinez's frustration. He stepped even closer, his tone dropping into a growl. You think this is funny? You think you can just sit here and play games? Snoop's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. I think you're doing a fine job of playing yourself, he said quietly. The words landed like a slap, and Martinez's face flushed red with anger. Before he could respond, the radio crackled again. Unit 12. No records found under the name Calvin Broadus matching the provided ID. Martinez stiffened, his grip on the radio tightening. What do you mean, no records? He demanded, his voice rising. Exactly what it sounds like, the dispatcher replied. No matches in the system. Higgins groaned audibly, rubbing his temple. That's enough, he said sharply, addressing his partner. We're not turning this into something it's not. Let's move on. But Martinez was too far gone to back down. He glared at Snoop, his frustration and humiliation boiling over. You're hiding something, he said through gritted teeth, and I'm going to find out what it is. Snoop stood slowly, his tall frame towering over Martinez. He adjusted his hood, revealing a lock of dark hair that fell across his forehead. If you're so determined, he said, his voice low but commanding, then maybe it's time I stop hiding. Before Martinez could respond, Snoop reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it up. A video began to play, the footage showing Martinez's earlier interactions with Snoop, complete with every harsh word and aggressive move captured in high definition. What is this? Martinez demanded, his voice trembling slightly. Snoop tilted his head, his calm gaze fixed on the officer. A live stream, he said simply. It's been running all day. Martinez's face paled as the realization sank in. You've been broadcasting this? To millions, Snoop replied, his voice steady. Every word, every action, it's all been recorded and shared in real time. The crowd that had begun to gather earlier was now larger, their phones raised as they recorded the unfolding drama. Whispers rippled through the group, words like abuse of power and disgrace floating in the air. Higgins stepped back, his face pale as he took in the gravity of the situation. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Martinez's eyes darted between Snoop and the crowd, his panic growing. "You set me up," he said, pointing an accusatory finger at Snoop. "I didn't set you up," Snoop said evenly. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said, that was all you." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger. News crews had begun to arrive, their cameras trained on the scene as reporters whispered urgently into their microphones. A voice cut through the chaos, firm and authoritative. "Officers, stand down." All eyes turned to see a woman in a crisp suit approaching. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to commanding respect, her badge identifying her as Captain Jane Monroe from the Internal Affairs Division. "Captain," Higgins said quickly, stepping forward. "We were just—" "I've already seen the footage," Monroe interrupted, her tone cold. "And I think the public's made their opinion pretty clear." She turned to Martinez, her sharp gaze cutting through him. "Hand over your badge and weapon," she said. "What?" Martinez stammered, his face pale. "You can't be serious." "Do it," Monroe said firmly. "You're on administrative leave, pending an investigation." The crowd erupted into cheers as Martinez reluctantly removed his badge and gun, handing them over with trembling hands. His humiliation was complete. Snoop watched the scene unfold, his expression calm but resolute. He turned to the cameras, addressing the audience with the same quiet authority he had shown all day. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Change starts with accountability." The crowd roared their approval, their applause echoing through the park. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Snoop walked away from the scene, his mission complete. But the conversation he had sparked was far from over. The bench where it all began became a symbol of change, a place where people left notes of their own, inspired by Snoop's words. "Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." This story isn't just about one person or one incident. It's about the importance of accountability, justice, and standing up against systemic biases. What would you do if faced with a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this important conversation alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story that challenges, inspires, and sparks change. Together, we can shed light on the issues that matter most and work toward a better, more just world.